Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I am Judy Wolf, Government Contracting Coordinator for the New York Small Business Development Center Network's Procurement Assistance Center. We are your host for today's webinar, What You Need to Know About Federal Cybersecurity Compliance and DFARS. Small Business Development Centers, or SBDCs, provide free, confidential business counseling for new and existing businesses, including business planning, marketing, financial, and other types of assistance, including guidance on navigating the world of government contracting and pursuing certifications as women, minority, or veteran-owned businesses, marketing your firm to government agencies and prime contractors, and finding and responding to bid opportunities. You can see our contact information at the end of the webinar should you be interested in contacting your local SBDC for a one-on-one appointment. There are 24 SBDC offices throughout the state, so there is sure to be one near you. Your microphones and telephones are currently muted to eliminate background noise during the program. To ask a question, you can type it into the question box on your control panel, and our presenter will save time to answer questions at the end of the presentation. Today's program is being recorded, and slides will be made available after the presentation. I'm pleased to introduce Reg Harnish, who is the CEO of Gray Castle Security, a leading cybersecurity risk assessment, advisory, and mitigation firm headquartered in Troy, New York. Reg is a nationally recognized speaker and has presented at countless industry events. He was recently recognized as the 2017 Cybersecurity Consultant of the Year by the Cybersecurity Excellence Awards, and he's been featured in Time, Forbes, CBS Nightly News, The Washington Post, and many others. Reg is a member of the Forbes Technology Council and a fellow of the National Cybersecurity Institute in Washington, D.C., and we are very pleased and honored to have him here with us today. I'm going to turn the presentation over to Reg. Welcome, Reg. Take it away.
Thank you, and appreciate the warm introduction there. Apparently my marketing team is very proud of me. So let's talk today about something we've found increasingly interesting to small businesses. Many of you who are struggling in the same ways that large businesses are, but don't have quite the resources that some of your peers may. And some of the challenges in cybersecurity really stem from this massive growth that we've seen, not just in things like headlines and breaches and incidents, security incidents, but also increasing regulatory pressure. And then I would add to that an increasing visibility on cybersecurity programs and risk management as well. And just generally speaking, we're seeing much more activity business to business, in the supply chain, in ecosystems, just in general business conversations around what are you doing to protect your assets, right? Or to manage your risk, or to protect my data, which you are a steward of or hosting for me. And so what's happened is, as I get into the introduction here, one second, I believe I've paused my screen sharing. Yeah, there's always something, right? Here we go. All right, so apologies there. So as I was starting to say, what we're seeing increasingly is a reliance, or certainly pressure, on individual organizations to deal with cybersecurity in a meaningful way. And as someone who works in this industry every single day, one of the trends we're seeing is that most businesses are not doing cybersecurity because they want to or because they like it, but rather that they're receiving pressure from a third party. And that could be a prospect who, if you don't have a cybersecurity program, you won't earn their business. It might be from a third party, regulatory agency, federal, state, local, tribal, that requires certain types of businesses to handle data and secure data in specific ways. Or it might be competitive, right? So your biggest competitor is doing X in cybersecurity, and so you feel like you need to compete with them. And while we like to see increasing activity, what this is all about is, let's take things like DFARS and turn it around in a way that creates business value, builds a culture of security in the organization, of course, checks all of those regulatory compliance checkboxes, but also gives us a competitive advantage. And the reality is that most of what we do in cybersecurity does not require you know, a rocket science degree. It's actually just a lot of hard work. And so I hope today to demystify some of the bigger material points here in terms of DFARS and its associated components, but certainly take any of your questions there at the end. So why are we here and why does DFARS exist? Well, let's remember that DFARS is really a component of the Federal Acquisition Regulation, which has everything to do with how the federal government, the DoD, et cetera, purchases or acquires services and products from the rest of America. And there's some very specific requirements around that. Obviously, we're going to stick to the cybersecurity components. There's lots of other language around you know, process and purchase ordering and those kinds of things, which we're not going to get into. But the primary reason that we're here is that the DoD figured out over the last few years that most of the compromise or breaches or incidents surrounding their data happened at third parties. And so they started to look outward towards these organizations who honestly weren't doing much from a cybersecurity perspective, and they came up with a system, DFARS, which pretty explicitly describes the types of controls and processes, policies and governance structures that you need if you're going to do business with the DoD or the federal government in general. You can see here some of the facts that support this decision on their part, but the reality is lots of organizations had access to their data, and many of them had been compromised or were proven to have deficient cybersecurity programs. And no different than most regulatory language, it only happens because we're not doing it ourselves. So, for example, if the federal government subcontracting community got together and said, "Hey, listen, we need to do better protecting the government's data. Let's impose or self-impose these types of restrictions and requirements on ourselves," the government would have never gotten involved. But unfortunately, in healthcare, credit card-based retailers, and the list goes on, the federal government has stepped in to provide rules to groups and communities who hadn't done this themselves. And so we are where we are. Now, just to give you sort of a visual perspective on the mass, the sheer vastness of the information that has been compromised over the last, well, now 3 years, federally protected information due to third-party negligence or mishandling or accidents. Let's face it, even organizations who have committed to an effective cybersecurity program are still subject to incidents and damages. Right, there are no guarantees in this business, as we know. But really, the vastness cannot be overstated here, and the importance of this, and the sort of the genesis of the incentive that the government had to start to enforce these types of cybersecurity regulations. So let's talk more about DFARS and some of its basic components, things like NIST 171 and a few of these other subparts. Real quick hierarchy that hopefully helps illustrate where DFARS falls in sort of the acquisition process, because there's a couple of things here that are related but not necessarily required by DFARS. I'm going to talk about each one of these components individually. Right, so at the top we have the Federal Acquisition Regulation, which is a very broad regulation around how the government buys stuff from third parties. Beneath that, so the defense federal, so really a supplement to FAR specific to the DoD and the defense contracting industry. Its subcomponents here from a cybersecurity perspective are 252.204, and that's both safeguarding as well as incident response, so 08 and 12. And I'm going to get into some more detail on these as well. And then supporting 08 is what we call adequate protections on controlled or unclassified information. I'll go through some of these definitions, but NIST 171 is really the foundation behind and provides description around specific security controls, standards, and metrics for supporting what is considered an adequate protection of this data. Now, prior to that was the 48 CFR 52, which was the basic safeguards. I'll talk very briefly about what those were, because essentially DFARS 08, 12, and 171 have extended those, and they've become more prescriptive. So what's DFARS? Kind of went into a little bit of this. The primary components that we'll talk about today are 252, 204, so 7008 and 7012. 8, again, as I said, is really a system for a cybersecurity control framework. In this case, NIST, a very standard, well-recognized cybersecurity framework. And safeguarding of information. So that includes defining what covered defense information is and controlled unclassified information, more specifically, the actual controls that are required, as well as a system and a metric, a rubric essentially, for measuring how well you're complying with those controls. You know, do they exist? Are they effective? And are they auditable? And we'll talk more about that. And then 12 really focuses on incident handling, reporting, and notification. And so there are some specifics that extend beyond 171 that are important to know, including some of the reporting procedures, the forms, timelines, and then the response process itself, which I'm going to get into each one of these. So let's start with 7008. And again, as I mentioned, the basis for this is primarily NIST 171, 14 families of controls. And I'll go into actually specifically what those are. But NIST SP 800-171 was born of NIST SP 800-53, which is a well-established cybersecurity framework, control framework for federal systems. Now, the difference is that for you as contractors and subcontractors, you do not have federal systems necessarily. What you have actually is considered a non-federal system very specifically. And the way we protect those is different. I assume that the folks on this that are attending here, this webinar, have already figured out that NIST 53 doesn't apply necessarily because they are not hosting federal systems, but rather they are the steward of the processor of federal data, in which case 171 would apply. And I'll talk about the differences between 53 and 171 as well. 12 is important because it defines specifically what an incident is. And in this case, it's actually very broad. One of the problems that we see in legislative and regulatory language is that government, the folks who are authoring these bills and these laws have never actually responded to a cybersecurity incident. They have no idea what it means. And so things like malware and terms like adequate security and response times and these terms are thrown around without a lot of contextual experience. And so it can be problematic interpreting the language, particularly in a small business environment where you don't have a general counsel on staff who's fluent in some of this regulatory language. But here's what it is, right? So actions taken through the use of computer networks, which is virtually everything on the internet today, but they can compromise or potentially adversely affect essentially CUI or CDI, right? Defense information or controlled unclassified information. Big, broad definition. This is good and bad in the sense that it's bad that it's not prescriptive, but it's also good in that it leaves a little bit of wiggle room for us to defend ourselves if, unfortunately, we do experience some type of compromise and there's legal action that is subsequent from that. 12 goes on to talk about some of the response functions that are critical. A lot of this does follow NIST 61, which is I'll say at this point, a nationally recognized standard for incident response planning and handling. But a couple of things just really important to know is that DFARS requires you, if you have an incident, right, that the definition on the prior page, if you experience an incident, that a specific procedure or plan needs to be followed, and you need to conduct a review, right, to understand and conclude whether or not there's been a compromise of defense information or CUI. And again, very vague. And there's some problems here because there's some implicit standard and handling procedures that are required here, even if the language doesn't say it. Right? So NIST 61 is what the feds expect you to apply. If you do not have an incident response plan, if you don't understand the process of chain of custody and preservation of evidence, incident commands, forensic investigation, computer investigation, if you don't understand all of these things, have experts that can do those and follow your plan, there's a gap there, and a concerning gap as we see cybercrime continue to be more frequent and more impactful. There's a specific reporting procedure. So this website here, dod.mil, has some forms and a specific process for reporting your suspected compromise or confirmed compromise to the DoD as well. And there's a form, and if you're not familiar with this form, it's going to require that you know or have significant information about the incident itself. So once again, if you haven't built an incident response capability, DFARS is requiring that of you. You need a plan, you need a team, and you need to be able to auditably prove that you're following that plan during incidents and reporting those things in a timely manner. I'll talk about some of the solutions here. Right now, I'm just kind of getting through the DFARS itself. Also, no different than Health and Human Services or the payment card industry, in the event of a breach or an incident, some type of compromise, the DoD reserves the right to conduct its own assessment. And we see this all the time in healthcare where, let's say there's a breach of patient records, HHS and OCR, Office for Civil Rights, show up and they conduct their own assessment. And honestly, they're not experts either. Even their breach response team I would not consider them experts. This is not something they're doing every day. And so you really run the risk of the feds finding something that you didn't or interpreting it differently and creating some misunderstandings and potentially worse than that. The safe bet here is to apply NIST 61, build an incident response capability, and be prepared to report in a timely manner, right? These things should be baked right into your incident response plan. So now coming back to 08 and some of the details around 171, because this is really the meat of the entire DFARS compliance program. The controls in 171, if you understand them, if you've conducted a standards-based risk assessment like 53 or 171, and you understand what it means to build a security roadmap or a corrective action plan, and you're making progress, you're probably in pretty good shape. And I say that because today, the feds have figured out that no one is compliant with any of their regulations, right? And even if they were, compliance is really a point in time, meaning, let's say you go and you do a 171 gap assessment and you figure out that you're compliant at the auditable level for every control. Well, tomorrow, if you introduce a new application or you buy one of your competitors or you open a new location or you hire a new employee, there's the potential that you are no longer compliant. So keep in mind that compliance is a sort of a moving target, and that you're looking at a window of compliance, which includes those three things, right? Your risk assessment, your corrective action plan, and progress. And again, focusing on those puts you in a much more defensible position. 171 is essentially a subset of NIST 53. Actually, NIST 53 is what was supporting all of the DoD systems until they made the determination that we should distinguish between federal systems and non-federal systems, even if the same data is present on both. And that's because NIST 53 is a big, onerous standard. There's 1,000 security controls in NIST 53, most of which are perhaps not necessary in smaller organizations. All that said, the scope for 171 is important as well, right? Because we're only applying controls to the environment, the assets, the scope of things, and that could be people, process, or technology, that apply to controlled unclassified information. So my guess is that unless 100% of your revenue comes from defense contracting, there's a percentage of your business that has nothing to do with the DoD, where there is no CUI and you're not working with the feds. That part of your business is not subject to DFARS if you can logically and physically segregate it and prove that there's no commingling of those environments. So important to know that the scope here is CUI, the framework is 171, and that there is some specific regulatory language around how incidents are interpreted and reported. We're on revision 1. Revision 1 included some nice enhancements as well to 171, clarified some things important there to know. I mentioned that it was based on 53. I won't get into that. 14 security control families. These are very basic, very fundamental groupings of the security controls. I'm going to show you what they are. And there's about 100 or so controls. So literally 10% of the NIST 53. There's 100 versus 1,000. And so with some hard work, this is achievable. And maintenance of a compliant environment is achievable. And as I said, it's not difficult, it's just hard work. It requires a commitment and a lot of push-ups, but there's no brain surgery here. It's not all that difficult. A couple more points about the differences between 53 and 171. If you've already adopted 53 and you're proceeding towards a 53 compliant framework, congratulations, that's fantastic. And you're not going to see anything new in here because, again, 171 is a subset of those 14 families controls. The first revision that we saw, I think, was in June of this year, included a couple of clarifications on multi-factor auth, encryption, and a couple of other technical controls as well. Actually, 171 in general, other than the governance structures like policies and procedures, is mostly technical. So where 53 gets into things like awareness and change management and governance and policies and procedures and security metrics, 171 is very, very much focused on technical controls, which also makes it easier. The average organization today has a much better sense of their security technology than they do their security people and security processes. A quick, step back here. As I mentioned, that a lot of the DFARS requirements were born of 53 and some of these basic safeguards that were required prior. So CFR 52204 was a cybersecurity component to FARS back in the day, and it included basically 15 very technical controls on the same types of data, right? So a couple of examples here, things like authentication, access controls, minimum necessary, a couple of, scanning, security monitoring, right? Understanding anomalies in your network and be able to detect and respond to those. Network segregation, again, CFR 52204 was all technical. I believe, actually, there may have been a physical security requirement, but the physical security controls were only there to support the technical security controls, if that makes sense, like locks on data centers and those kinds of things. So this is where we've come from, and we've really evolved to a point where the DoD is really asking you to do things that you should probably be doing anyway. So that's the good news. So let's talk about the scope here, which is, cover defense information, or CUI. I believe that those terms are pretty much interchangeable, at least in terms of DFARS today. There's some specific examples, and the government does as good a job as it can in defining what CUI actually is. But essentially what it means is you've got classified systems, you potentially have classified systems, right? So defense information and other data that is actually classified by the federal government. DFARS and CUI are governing all of the other stuff. So anything that is not classified, right? Because you've already got specific requirements for protecting classified information that is outside the scope of anything that we're talking about here today. So again, scope is important because there are ways to minimize the effort required to comply with DFARS if you know what kind of data you have, where it is, and what controls are in place today. But if you have any questions, you can go to this .gov site here, and it gives you a whole list of categories and examples of what CUI is in your environment. And most likely, 95% of the time, you'll be able to find stuff and compare it to what you're doing, and it makes it pretty easy. A couple of other obvious classifications. So you have CUI if it was identified specifically in a contract. So if you are subcontracting or contracting with the feds, and right in the engagement letter, right in the procurement process, the contract, it says, we are giving you CUI in the form of this. So if it's specifically labeled CUI, it's CUI. It doesn't matter what interpretation you have of it. If the government has told you that you are in possession of this, or you're processing it, then that is also considered in scope as well. And then generally, anything that's any data that's created, stored, transmitted, processed, or used in the fulfillment of that DoD contract is also considered CUI as well, as long as it's not already classified. Some examples here. Again, you can find a complete list here at this archives.gov site, and I won't get into that today. A couple of things here, just interestingly though, things like source code, for me, because source code is oftentimes an artifact of a contract, it's not the contract itself, unless you're actually building software for the feds. That source code can be considered CUI as well. So it's not just like ones and zeros in a spreadsheet or a database row that is considered CUI. It could be things like diagrams and other things. So let's talk specifically about the controls in 171. So first of all, these are the 14 families. Most of these should look very familiar to you. Obviously, they all came out of NIST 53. They're not applied the same way. The methodology is different, but essentially the controls are exactly the same. So for example, access controls, things like passwords and directory services and authentication, and these are all very standard cybersecurity controls, many of which you probably have in place today, some of which may need to be augmented or enhanced, and then some may not exist, right? Media protection, things like encryption and shredding of CDs and other removable devices. Security assessment has everything to do with the risk assessment that you're conducting. What framework are you leveraging? How are you measuring compliance or risk? Awareness, people, and process around behavioral security. Incident response, we talked a little bit about. So important to know that the controls that are identified in 171 for response are directly complementary to what is required of you in that subpart 012. And so don't worry about those contradicting. Personnel security, things like background screening and drug testing, as well as roles and responsibilities around minimum necessary and role-based access controls. For me, though, the big one is the second to last here, is risk assessment. Because for any organization, large or small, there are a couple of problems in cybersecurity. One is you may not really sure where to start in the first place. The second problem is you're not sure which order to pursue cybersecurity controls in. And the third is you're not sure how much of it to actually do. A couple of great examples. Every business I know out there has a firewall. Most of those businesses today, believe it or not, could unplug their firewall completely without a real meaningful change in their risk posture. And that's because firewalls now do such a small piece of a good cybersecurity program, and it's gotten smaller and smaller over time, that there are much bigger fish to fry. But you would not know that unless you've conducted an effective standards-based risk assessment. Right? The risk assessment answers all of those questions. It goes through your control framework. It talks about threats and vulnerabilities. It helps you inventory your assets or create a well-defined scope around CUI, which computers and networks, which people, which processes touch CUI. And then it prioritizes all of those based on, first of all, the impact if one of those controls to data, if one of those controls is compromised, and then probably more importantly, likelihood. In our business, impact we understand pretty well. So if I tell you you're going to have a heart attack, you can tell me that it's going to be expensive, it's going to hurt, it's going to require a lot of recovery, but you can't necessarily, and I can't tell you when you're going to have a heart attack. Same is true in cybersecurity. So impact we're pretty good at. Likelihood is a little more difficult. So the risk assessment will actually drive all of the other control families, the order that you're going to do them in, and to what depth you'll apply these controls. So, as I mentioned earlier, 3 things are critically important for your compliance program and outside of 171. The first is you got to do a risk assessment based on NIST SP 800-30, leveraging the 171 control framework. 2 is you got to build a corrective action plan. And 3 is you got to show progress. You cannot continue to show the same risks year over year and expect for leniency when there's a breach or some type of compromise. So let's talk about governance, right? So policies, procedures, plans, all of the stuff that define the rules of the road, the cybersecurity rules for your organization. They've got to be healthy. They have to be relevant. They have to be appropriate and adequate, meaning you can't just copy and paste someone else's policies. That just doesn't work anymore. And then they have to be what I call auditable. What that means is that if someone asks you if you have an access control policy, and you say, oh yeah, here's a beautiful access control policy, and you can produce that document, but it hasn't been looked at in 4 years, no one's accountable for the access control policy itself, and you can't prove that it's being enforced, it's basically like the policy doesn't exist, because a piece of paper doesn't really count for much anymore. Really, there's more depth to this. So governance becomes really important, and it's not just policies, it's procedures, it's your awareness plan, it's your incident response plan, it's your business continuity plan, it's big structural procedures and processes that define how you go about doing things, the mission and the vision of the organization, and the purpose for cybersecurity in the first place. Those have to be really healthy. Every one of these, I'll just take a quick step back, every one of these sections has requirements on policy and documentation around governance. So be prepared to write a lot of policy and plan and procedure if they don't exist. Now the good news is that policy can be defensible and adequate and appropriate with just a little bit of language. Keep in mind that if you're architecting your policies accurately and sensibly, you don't need a lot of language, right? Here's an example of a policy document that we wrote for one of your peers, right? So a DoD contractor, and this was completely acceptable to the agency that they were working with. And that's because we supported it with this architecture, right? So policy is one piece of this. The policy describes the organization's general position, your feelings on access control, for example, or awareness, but then it also references things like standards. It defines how to handle exceptions, because there are always exceptions in an organization. It's supported by detailed step-by-step procedures, and they may cover a lot of different areas. So the policy may say, we're going to ensure that employee and contractor behaviors don't introduce undue risk to the organization. We're going to do this through a combination of training, education, testing, and other types of activities. Now, that's a great policy. Now, the standard we're going to leverage is, of course, NIST 66, I think, is awareness. I get them confused sometimes. And we're going to leverage, here are the procedures for conducting an awareness training, et cetera. And see how this all works together. If you break up the content in this sense, your policy can be very, very simple. Incident response, as it relates to 171, is pretty specific, and it does lean on NIST 61 for the larger framework and process. But the term rapidly, of course, concerns me. I'm not sure what rapidly means. Generally speaking, though, it's being interpreted these days as soon as you know, you've got 3 days to conduct your assessment and the damage assessment, and then report it to the DoD. Any shorter than that, we generally recommend to our clients that they take all 72 hours, because in most cases, an incident is not closed in 3 days, certainly anything significant. Maybe if it's just a couple of compromised credentials or an infected PC, that's one thing. But if you've been hit by ransomware or a more significant breach of CUI or other classified information, you've got a much bigger situation to deal with, and typically in 3 days, you don't have all of that data. So we recommend take the full 72 hours, absolutely make sure that you're following your incident response plan to a T, because what's going to happen is there's going to be a lot of scrutiny on you. So if your plan says you're going to do 1, 2, and 3, well, guess what? You better have done 1, 2, and 3, because now not only is there an investigation because of the breach, but now there's going to be sort of a double whammy because you didn't even follow your own procedure. So that's really important. As I mentioned, things like forensic imaging and analysis, computer investigations, these things are really important to have that expertise. You probably won't have them on staff. And whether you use Greycastle or another response team doesn't really matter. Just make sure you're not trying to find a good incident response team in the middle of an incident. And then, of course, as I mentioned, be prepared for some follow-up assessments by the DoD themselves. The same is true for all of your contractors, right? So some of the language in 171 speaks to the ecosystem or the supply chain and vendor risk or third-party risk in some cases. Keep in mind that if you've outsourced some of your own corporate functions or data processing functions to a third party, that now you're liable for their security as well. So what we're seeing throughout in the defense contracting space is a massive reorganization and a reassessment of third parties from the top all the way down, because now you're getting hit from every direction. Now not only are you getting hit from the contractors that you're subcontracting to, but now you've got to deal with the 10 or 15 organizations and third parties that are helping you do your business. And so there's a lot of, let's say, third party or external scrutiny and pressure on these security controls. Language around DFARS compliance needs to be in your contracts with them. So if today you make no reference to 171 and breach reporting requirements in your subcontractor contracts, that's got to be added. And then there needs to be a process around assessing contractor risk, right? So you need to have an inventory of every subcontractor that has access to CUI or CDI on your behalf, and you need to inventory their or assess their cybersecurity programs. And the aggregate risk needs to be rolled up into your plan. Now again, this is a fairly simple process, but it does take some time, and it needs to be based on standards that are acceptable to the feds. The cloud does not eliminate liability. In fact, there is no way to outsource liability. It does not matter what you do or how little of your actual processing you do, you own the liability. There is no way to outsource liability. Now, things like cyber liability insurance and a good risk assessment and an effective cybersecurity program make all of that seem irrelevant anyway. But just know that that's how it works in the legal world. You can't get rid of that. There's some other things here too in terms of cloud computing you should be aware of, right? So the FedRAMP requirements, moderate, which is another 53 implementation. You need to make sure that you are, particularly for organizations that are handling a lot of your data, whether it's Dropbox or it's Google, doesn't matter. Most of those organizations are prepared to respond to your inquiries around their cybersecurity program, and many of them have compliance programs already in place that make it easy. But we're also using lots of other third parties, right? Not all of us are using Google for document storage. Asset ownership becomes huge because very typically in cybersecurity, if someone's name isn't on it, it's not going to get done. And so you need to make sure that from your corrective action plan to the assets that you've defined, right, the unclassified information, you know exactly who owns those, and they're making security decisions, meaning they're involved in the risk assessment and they're involved in the mitigation plan, the corrective action plan, because they technically own that asset, and they need to have authority to make decisions because they're being held accountable for those. Now, if you can go through your entire environment, and as you're inventorying and you're scoping out your CUI for DFARS compliance, it makes it real easy. You've got a spreadsheet with 10 line items on it, and you put a name next to it, and then a status of the cybersecurity controls for that particular asset. And you've done half the work in terms of asset ownership. And of course, that dovetails nicely into your corrective action plan, as well as a proof and evidence of progress towards risk mitigation. An example of how this might look, keep in mind that NIST 171 touches every organization every department in your organization. There are no exceptions. Human resources, finance, risk, compliance, facilities, IT, every one of those departments has ownership, right? So there's what's becoming an accepted standard in cybersecurity is that this is not about IT. In fact, IT has a smaller and smaller piece of cybersecurity as the years pass. And that's because technology is a small part. We can't ask IT to make good decisions on unclassified information. They don't have the knowledge of that. And so looking at this, you can see that really this is an organizational issue. This is not an IT issue. And that means you need to get the rest of the organization involved, make them accountable, name them officially as an asset owner, and then give them the authority to make good cybersecurity decisions, right? Whether it's budgetary or password length, doesn't really matter. So a sample here. There needs to be a process for handling exceptions in every single business, organization, agency, department, doesn't matter. There are always times when you cannot comply for one or more reasons. That's okay. Don't feel like you have to comply at the utmost level with every control if they're not applicable, or if it creates more risk or more expense from a risk perspective than it would if you were to be compromised. So meaning, don't build a $100 fence around a $10 horse, if you know what I mean. So exceptions are acceptable. They have to be documented. They have to be very clear. There has to be an expiration date on the exception, and someone needs to have requested or submitted it. It has to have been reviewed and approved, and then there has to be a re-review date on that, at which you go back and look at the exceptions, and they either expire or you renew that. But really important, this process, because what happens is many organizations anyway, as they're going through, let's say they're building policy, the minute they deploy their brand new policy, they're in violation of their own rules. And so they need to be prepared to defend their exceptions. Now, just a little bit of, I guess, personal advice. You can't have an exception for every control in the 171. That doesn't fly, right? So it's got to be adequate, appropriate, and well documented. A couple of implementation basics, and then I'll start to wrap up here. The first is that this is based on good classification. So if you're not familiar with FIPS 199, it's time to be so, because that process really supports all of the NIST cybersecurity standards and gives you a really good procedure for defining CUI and its criticality. The criticality, then, of course, that drives the investment that you'll make in those controls in your environment. But there's 100 reasons to classify your data. Honestly, it should be one of the first things you do. Your risk assessment that you conduct virtually requires that you do data classification, because again, we don't want to waste time, money, and energy securing things that aren't all that critical. But to save that time, money, and energy, we need to know what is critical. And so you have to have that process. But it does lots of great things for your organization, certainly culturally, and reducing risks in people and education, minimizing your security budget. There's a lot of benefits to classifying. Don't do anything other than FIPS 199 for your classification procedure. It just doesn't make sense. You can invent a wheel if you in other areas, but I would say classification 199 is, if not a little bit cumbersome and wordy at times, it's effective, and you can boil it down to something very basic. This is one of the only things that's difficult in cybersecurity, classifying data. 199 makes it way easier for you. Try to leverage your existing controls. All of you are doing something in cybersecurity today. You may not have a fully compliant NIST 53-based framework that you're operating from, but what you want to do is look to kill lots of birds with one stone. So if you are a subcontractor that's also taking credit cards, some of the stuff that's required by PCI is also required by 171. Figure out a way to take that one control and comply with multiple regulatory requirements or commercial requirements, and save yourself a lot of headaches. All of these major frameworks, by the way, PCI 27002, 171, NIST Cybersecurity, it's basically all the same controls. So there shouldn't be any mystery there. Now they're all organized differently, and they may have different focuses or a different way to measure efficacy. But generally speaking, it's all the same controls. So take your existing policy, take your existing access control infrastructure and directory services, your existing endpoint encryption, your existing change management process, and just apply that or tweak that so that it satisfies each one of these things. That's actually not all that difficult. Educate, blank slide, because culture eats technology all day long. If your people are aware of their responsibilities and they feel like they're part of the cybersecurity solution, they are your greatest defense. Now, on the other hand, they can also be your greatest weakness if you don't take the time to change their behaviors. So education is actually required by 171. Testing and efficacy are not. Sometimes the government stops a little bit short, meaning it requires that you have an awareness program, but it does not require that you have a good awareness program. So focus on education, get your checkbox, but keep in mind that every one of your cybersecurity risks, and I mean this quite literally, comes down to a person. It's not technology. So getting started, last points I'll make. You gotta create scope here. So you gotta understand where your CUI is, create that asset inventory, classify it, assign ownership to each one of those, and that's the basis for your risk assessment, which then provides your corrective action plan to which you can make progress. It's the start for everything. A gap assessment, right? So different than a risk assessment. A gap assessment, there's no consideration given to impact and likelihood. It's a binary comparison. Are you doing this? And in this case, it's interesting because DFARS requires the gap assessment, but 171 itself requires the risk assessment. And my advice, skip the gap assessment, get right to the risk assessment, because that's a superset of gaps. Not only are you identifying the gap, but you're identifying the criticality and the priority of that gap as well. Identify your owners. Really, really important. Make this an organizational issue, not an IT issue. Your corrective action plan can be very simple. You know, an Excel spreadsheet. Here are the 5 things that we're going to do over the next 12 months. Here's the start date, the end date, expected level of effort. Here's the risks that it's addressing, the controls that are tied to this or associated with it. Here's the individual, the asset owner who's responsible for these controls, or the control owner. Make a basic corrective action plan, and then make that a living document. Continue to keep that updated over time. And then last, time is short. You know, we've been talking about DFARS for some time now. You know, this, I guess, I suppose is the bad news, is that you really have until the end of the year. Now, is the DoD going to deploy an army of DFARS auditors on January 1st of next year? No chance of that. However, you can certainly be sure that there will be intense visibility and repercussions in contracts. If you do have an incident or are compromised, or if there's suspicion of that, you can expect that that's when the auditors and regulators will show up, or your third parties, because you're getting pressure from a lot of different directions to comply with this basic cybersecurity framework. So December 31, not unreachable for small organizations. The advantage you have over, you know, Lockheed Martin is that you've got small surface area. You don't have a lot of computers, you don't have a lot of people, you don't have a lot of data, you don't have a lot of connections to the internet. So this is something that should be achievable, I think, by everyone on the phone. I did take a quick look through the attendees, and from what I can see, most of you are smaller organizations. So even with only 3 months left, you could definitely make a big dent in your DFARS compliance program and really put you in a good position for next year. One quick commercial here. If you want more information on DFARS and other types of cybersecurity regulations, our 5th annual Cybersecurity Symposium is on October 11th, right here in Albany. Encourage you to check out our website for more information, or just go to symposium.greatcastlesecurity.com. It'll be a great show. And that leads me to the end here. And so I'll turn it back over to the team for any questions that may have come in.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Reg. We really appreciate it. Got a couple of questions here. Looking like one question is, why did the security requirements change to the NIST SP 800-171? And what's the difference between 53 and 171? You were talking about that earlier.
Yeah, so they changed because, well, I think really two reasons. One is that 53 was way too broad and onerous for the vast majority of small contractors out there, right? 53 is great for Lockheed, not great for most of you. The second thing is that with 171 and DFARS, they better defined CDI and controlled unclassified information. So the scope changed a little bit as well. And then last, they wanted to add some language around breach reporting. Because again, keep in mind, almost the entire purpose or reason for DFARS today was to what they considered breach control, breach management. And so this is really around compromise of their data. I think if no one was getting hit and compromised and exposing DoD information, we wouldn't be facing these types of requirements right now.
Excellent. And then you talked a bunch about that 72-hour reporting time. Like, how does a contractor report a cybersecurity incident under DFARS?
Yep. So two things. One, the clock starts ticking the moment you declare an incident. So there's a little bit of gray area there, and your incident response plan should support you, meaning there should be some language in there that is what's considered triage, right? So pre-declaration. And then once you do declare an incident, that's when the clock starts ticking, and that's when you're moving into full response mode. Again, important to have a response capability, not only for your own business viability, safety, security, and reputation, but because it's just good practice today as well for protecting these types of data.
Thank you. And then you talked about this some at the end, but as a small business owner who may not have the level of technical expertise of some of the medium and larger sized companies, where do you go to learn more? Like, do you have any recommended resources there? And then in going through that checklist, how do you prioritize?
So two questions in there, and I don't want to make this a sales pitch. However, the average small government contractor doesn't have the resources, the technical expertise or bandwidth. They may have the funds to do it, because in many cases we see them passing along the cost of their DFARS compliance in the contract. And so my suggestion is to look at an organization that can handle everything from encryption to access control to incident response and responding to your breaches, to doing your risk assessment and building your corrective action plan for you, and doing it in a way that they act as if they're really just part of your company. They virtualize the entire cybersecurity function. And I'll just make one statement. That's exactly what we do at Great Castle Security. So we encourage you to reach out to us and ask questions from that perspective. You have the same problems, you don't have the same resources. Unfortunately, I've forgotten the second part of that question. What was that?
How do you prioritize where to start, basically?
Yep. So start with your risk assessment. That satisfies a huge percentage of 171. If you do a risk assessment based on NIST SP 800-30, which includes inventorying your CUI, creating scope, and then classifying that information, the risk assessment will take you right through every one of the 171 controls. It will ask you questions like, do passwords exist on critical assets? Are they effective? Are they consistent? Can you prove it? Meaning, are they auditable? And then as you get through this scoring mechanism, you should have come up with, right? So obviously this is something that Great Castle would bring to you, soup to nuts. But if you're trying to do your own risk assessment, you want a scoring mechanism that all you have to do is fill out a couple of numbers and then sort by aggregate risk at the end. That's your priority. Most of you, your issues are going to be in three areas. One, you probably haven't done a risk assessment, so that's a major risk. Two, user behaviors are not where they should be. And three, you don't have an incident response capability. I would expect that every organization that's on there, every attendee on this phone, those are in three of your top 5 risks. See it every day. Beyond that, things like business continuity planning, access controls is a place where people are falling down. Encryption, not so much anymore. It's become pretty easy to do that, but we're still seeing some problems there as well. and things like role-based access control, so evolving your access control mechanism so it's based on role. These are some very common areas, and would not be surprised if all of you saw evidence of deficiency in each one of those.
Excellent, thank you. And then probably related to that on some level, what, if you can provide this, is the typical cost that a small business can expect in implementing a cybersecurity program that's compliant with DFARS?
So there's no number. It depends on obviously the scale of your organization, right? How much of this data exists. It depends on how much of a security program, how kind of controls you have in place today, and that also depends on how long you wait. Right, the longer you wait, if you're really trying to comply by the deadline, if you don't start until December 1st, obviously the costs are going to go way up. That said, for a small business, I think my sales team would kill me if I threw out numbers. My guess is that it's no more than hiring a cybersecurity expert. Right, so if you had thought about hiring someone to do all of your cybersecurity stuff, for those same exact dollars, you can get an entire team of experts who are on demand. They're expert in every single area and are committed to the same cybersecurity program that you're building. And they're probably doing it for lots of your peers as well. So I guess the short answer is, take whatever number you thought you were going to spend on a person or people in cybersecurity to help you deal with all of these mounting cybersecurity issues, and instead spend that on a program, a virtualized program like what we offer, and deal with every bit of your cybersecurity issue, and just make the problem go away and not spend any more money.
And it's sounding like it is typically bring in a specialized person, either as an employee or as an outsourced.
Yeah, well, the problem
resource.
is, so NIST, so 171 only has 100 controls, but it's 14 different types of security. Where are you going to find someone who has 14 different areas of expertise? And if you could find them, they'd be very expensive. And even if you could afford them, they're not going to stay long, right? Salaries in cybersecurity are crazy right now. And after a year's worth of experience, people can go wherever they want and make 20, 30, 50% more. So the cybersecurity talent shortage has really created a massive problem for organizations, certainly opportunity for us because it's the exact problem that we address. But yeah, it's challenging today, no doubt.
Excellent. And we're coming down to the end of our time together. So if there are any other questions, you could type them into the questions bar.
Yep, I encourage everyone to connect with me on social media if they enjoy cybersecurity rants. But certainly, as an organization, we give away a lot of advice for free in newsletters and social media and blog posts and things like that. And then back to you guys.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much. Thank you to everyone who joined the call today. Again, this has been recorded, and we will be distributing it as well as the slides after the event. And if you know of your colleagues or if you have fellow small business owners who were unable to attend the conference but would be interested, please encourage them to contact us and we can make sure that they have access to the recording as well. So thank you again all for coming. Thank you so much, Reg, and all the folks over at Grey Castle. It's been a pleasure working with you, and we'll look forward to, we also have another cybersecurity webinar, Cybersecurity for Small Business, coming up on October 25th at 10 a.m. So a more general look at just cybersecurity in general, not just for federal contractors, but all small business, also presented by folks over at Grey Castle. So thank you all again. Thank you, Reg.
Thank you, everyone.
Have a great day.
Enjoy your day. Bye-bye.